Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Modesty's Mortgage Masterclass. I am Ike Naumezike, the Director of Modesty Financial Consultants Limited, based in Luton, United Kingdom. First of all, let me apologize for bringing you this episode later than I would have loved to and later than I would have expected to do. We encountered some technical hitches while trying to upload the video on Wednesday, and so painfully I've had to do this all over again. But then that's all fine. I'm very happy to do it a million times over as long as it benefits you. So today we're going to be talking about a very simple process, simple in theory, but really the process itself is more complicated than you can make of it. And what process am I talking about? I'm talking about a house buying process. When you want to buy a house, there are processes that are involved, and it's not just like something you go on the internet and you pick a house and you pay for it online with your credit card or debit card, and then that's it. House buying is a complicated legal process, and you really need to understand those processes for you to know exactly what's going to happen and what's happening and when each process and each stage is going to end. So this topic is inspired by the questions I keep getting from potential mortgage applicants who come to me to say, Iken, I want to buy a house. How do I go about it? I want to buy a house. How do I go about it? So that is the answer to this question. How do I go about it? It's not just about first-time buyers. It's also applicable to existing homeowners who maybe are looking to move home, and maybe some of them have not been involved in house buying process for ages. In fact, I met a couple the other day who have lived in their property for nearly 60 years, and they are looking to buy another property to downsize and retire in that property. So you can imagine what a daunting process is going to be for them, especially if they are going to have to involve mortgages. So in this instance, I am going to assume that your process involves mortgages. So first of all, the house buying process, it looks like something like this. A snapshot of it looks like, okay, you get you establish how much you can borrow, and then you get a mortgage, and the mortgage broker tells you how much you can borrow, and you go in and find a property. When you find a property, you make an offer, and then you make after making an offer, you make a formal mortgage application. From that formal mortgage application, you go on to exchange of contracts and then completion. Sounds easy, doesn't it? But then let's break these steps down. So when you want to buy a property, first of all, I need to let you understand that there are different ways you can buy a property, but the most popular way of buying properties in England and Wales these days is by private treaty. And buying properties through private treaty is different from buying properties on auction. So by private treaty, it follows the normal process of advertising the property, and you're dealing with the vendor who has decided to sell the property by private treaty. Treaty really means some sort of agreement. Okay, so it's different from buying properties on auction and other public means of buying property. So we assume that this is a private treaty arrangement, and then we will focus on England and Wales for the purpose of this topic. Buying properties in Scotland has a different process altogether, but we'll focus on England and Wales for the purpose of this. So the first thing you need to do is to establish a budget. How do you establish a budget? Because you don't know how much you can afford to spend on a property. How would you know how much property you are looking for, or the value of the property you'll be searching for? So you establish a budget first of all. How do you do that? You go to a mortgage broker or to a lender. They ask you a few questions around your finances, around your circumstances, around your income, your savings, other sources of income that's available to you to finance the purchase of that property. And based on that, on the information you have provided the lender or the mortgage broker, they work out what you can afford and what you can borrow. So establishing your budget basically tells you how much you can borrow towards buying that property. And then when you add the amount of mortgage you can get based on your circumstances or your income, you add that to the amount of deposit that's available to you, then you have a budget of how much you have available to buy a property. and that's the only time you can now go out there and know exactly what sort of property you'll be looking for and the price range of properties you'll be looking for. Remember, this is only applicable when you're buying through a mortgage. Okay, so affordability checks that are run by the broker or the lender just tells you how much you can borrow. And remember, these affordability checks and this information is not binding on the lender. It's not like a binding arrangement between you and the lender. The lender is not bound by it. It is only an indication based on the information you have provided. If you now want to take that a step further, there will be a formal mortgage application which will take into consideration all your income and expenditures and evidence of the income you have already told them. All the documents will come in and further checks will be carried out and credit checks will be carried out. Those are the things that will determine whether you get the mortgage finally or not. But this is a good place to start, establishing a budget first. So what does establishing a budget do for you as a borrower? What it does for you as a borrower when you establish a budget is that it helps you know exactly what the price range of property that you'll be looking at. It helps you establish the price range of property that you will be looking at. Again, it also tells you whether you can fund the deposit required to buy that property. So the property is £120,000, for example, and based on your information, you can borrow £100,000. There is still £20,000 left to make up the price of that property. So have you got the £20,000 deposit either in your savings or through family gifted deposit or through the remortgage of your existing property or through other additional forms of income that you may have? So basically you have to establish whether you have got the deposits that you can fund the deposit required to buy that property. That's the second thing that establishing a budget helps you do. Also, it helps you determine whether you can meet the costs, the other costs of purchasing that property. It's not just about the mortgage and getting the deposits. There are valuation costs, there are lender fees, there are legal fees, there are broker fees to pay if you're using a broker. These things cost money. You need to put all these things into context and then aggregate them. The budget establishment helps you determine whether you can meet with these costs considering the amount of money or resources available to you. Okay, so that's for establishing a budget. What do you do next? You now go on to find the property. How do you find the property? There are various ways and various media that you can find properties these days. You can find properties online through online portals like Zoopla, Rightmove, Prime Location, On the Market, and all of them. You can find properties on pages of newspapers. You can go into estate agents' offices to look at properties that they have displayed on there. Word of mouth referrals. People do tell people, oh, I've got a property to sell. Do you know anybody who wants to buy? You can also find properties, that way. But the most popular way of finding properties these days is online. Research carried out shows that even as far back as 2013, 95% of property searches happened online as far back as 2013, and 100% of people aged between 18 and 24 searched for their properties. They looked online when they were searching for their properties to buy. That tells you where most people are looking at these days when they are searching for properties. And that explains really why high street estate agents have been struggling these days. So some estate agents, because of that, have moved their operations online. Some of them have downsized and they've just maintained a hub because people no longer troop into estate agents' offices to look for properties. The media have opened up opportunities for searching for properties. These days, properties even pop up on your Facebook. You can find properties on sites like Gumtree and Facebook and all the rest of them. People advertise properties all over the place these days. Even on eBay, you can buy a property on eBay. So these are areas that are available for you online to search for properties when you want to find a house. So it's not just estate agents who can tell you where to find properties. Now, when you want to get involved with an estate agent, most property sales are handled through estate agents. Rarely would you see people who would sell their property without an estate agent being involved. And then you begin to ask yourself, or have you asked yourself, what are the roles of estate agents? What role do they really play in buying and selling a property? In places like the US, a buyer uses an agent as well as a seller, but it's not the same way it applies to buyers and sellers here in the UK. Here in the UK, vendors represent estate agents represent vendors, that is the seller. So the buyer most times don't even use agents. They just use their solicitors to negotiate, the sales process and to get around it and do the legal work. Yeah, they identify a property, they want to buy it, and they put in an offer, and the solicitor does the rest. So the vendor is looked after by the estate agent. So the estate agent is working in the best interest of the seller, and because it is the seller who is paying the estate agent, not the buyer. So that's basically what the estate agent is there for, protecting the interest of the estate agent. The estate agent's job as well involves marketing the property and getting the best available price for his client, who is the vendor. So they handle the negotiation, they market the property on all the portals, and they handle negotiation. And the aim is to get the best price of the best price available and the best price possible for their client, who is the vendor. And then the estate agents, they used to have physical presence, on the high streets, but not any longer. Like I said, the emergence of the internet and people going online to search for properties have really put a lot of estate agents out of business. Last year, as at September last year, 2019, the half-yearly report showed that the number of estate agents who have exited the high street is 143, and the number of estate agents who have entered the high street is 43. So there's a net withdrawal from the high street of 100 estate agents just by the half of last year. So by middle of last year, we have already lost net 100 estate agents on the high street because of the competition posed by people going online these days to look for properties. Because do you know that online, through a lot of these portals, you can actually contact the estate agents? So a lot of the communication, a lot of the negotiation, a lot of the even booking viewings and all that with the estate agents can be done online. So a lot of the things that take people into the estate agent's office can already be done online these days. So that's really affected the way estate agents operate. So you tend to see a lot of estate agents who operate online or who are not on the high street. Myself inclusive, I am an estate agent. I don't have a high street presence. I have an office where I conduct my estate agency business and advertise my properties online, and I represent the vendors, and I get inquiries about viewings, and I book viewings online as well from people who want to view properties for sale, to let, and landlords contact us online as well to come and value their property. So you can see our job as estate agents have changed a lot. But I also double as a mortgage broker, so that I offer these services under one roof and I'm not on the high street. Okay, so when you have found a property, assuming you have now found a property, the third process now involved in this house buying process is to make an offer to buy. So when you have found a property and the property says the asking price is £200,000, you put in an offer. You can put in an offer, not really a ridiculous offer, a reasonable offer, looking at the asking price and knowing by your own valuation what you think the property is worth. Right? Sometimes ridiculous offers do work. It may be that the property has been on the market for too long, and then if you know the circumstances surrounding the property, you are better informed and in a better position to put in an offer. So if you have done your research, it will tell you what a reasonable offer is. If maybe the property has been on the market for a very long time and you think you can tempt the seller with a ridiculous offer, and the seller might be in a position to say, I want to sell, I want to float this quickly and move on, you can put in an offer that is way below the asking price and see if the seller will be tempted to sell. That's one trick you can try. But then most offers tend to come in at reasonable range. There isn't that much difference between them the offer and the asking price. Okay, so you put in an offer because the seller has put that asking price. You put in an offer and see if the offer gets accepted. So that offer is made subject to contract. So it means when you put in an offer, even if that offer is accepted, it is still not a binding contract between you and the vendor. It's made subject to contract, which means from that point till the point contracts are exchanged, none of the parties, the buyer nor the seller, none of them are bound into any kind of arrangement or agreement. So either party can withdraw from the transaction, from the sale of the property at any time before the contracts are exchanged. And when you withdraw at that stage, there are no penalties and there are no compensation due the other party. Yeah, so that's why even when properties are sold, you can see property board signs saying sold, STC. It simply means sold subject to contract. So up until the time contracts are exchanged, nobody is bound by any agreement or any arrangement. It's sold, it's been agreed, the process is ongoing, but as long as contracts are not exchanged, either party can withdraw from the sale anytime. There are two terms I want you to be very aware of. They don't happen very often, but they do happen. Just that you're aware of them in case you are a victim or you've been a victim or you may become a victim. One of them is called gazumping. Yeah, gazumping is basically when the vendor accepts one offer from a particular buyer and then somewhere along the line ends up accepting a higher offer from another buyer. It's called gazumping. So it simply means that the vendor has found an offer better than yours and has accepted even after accepting your own offer. Some people get devastated when this happens to them, and it causes a lot of bad blood or bad feelings between the buyer and the seller. It does happen, although it doesn't happen very frequently. There is also the other term called gazundering. Yeah, this is when the buyer, trying to be cheeky in the process of buying the property, before exchange of contract happens, the buyer now said, you know what, that property I offered 190,000. I want to bring the offer down to 180,000 pounds. That's what I'm offering now. So this really annoys a lot of sellers, especially when you're close to exchange of contract. But some buyers are cheeky. They will do that just to see if the seller will be tempted to sell, because the seller will now think about having to advertise this property again, having to go through all this process again, and they might be forced to just say, okay, yes, I accept it. It's a cheeky thing to do. Some people do it. It's not a very wise thing to do, because it may put you in a very bad place in terms of next time you want to do a transaction and you come into contact with the same agent or the same buyer, you might find it difficult having to get a deal done. But it's called gazundering, so it happens. Okay, so when after making that offer and the offer is accepted, yeah, and you have agreed with the seller to buy the property, what is the next step? The next step now is to make a formal mortgage application. So the buyer needs to start, you as a buyer, you need to start a formal mortgage application now. So it is likely that you would have had a decision in principle prior to you putting in an offer. Now, a decision in principle is a document or a certificate from a lender saying, we have agreed in principle to lend you this money subject to full mortgage application based on the information you have provided to us. It's very possible at that stage that the lender doesn't have all the documents to back up your claims, which you did during the decision in principle stage. Now, as a mortgage broker, the way I approach things is I always prepare myself before I go into full mortgage application. And how do I do that? I get all the documents up front. All my clients will tell you that. I always tell you the list of documents I want to see before we even start processing a decision in principle. So once you get those documents to me and I put in a decision in principle and that decision in principle gets accepted, I am confident that the formal mortgage application will be successful because I've got the documents offer, and that's why our success rate is very high, because we prepare ourselves for the decision in principle as if we are doing the formal mortgage application, which is the right thing to do, because there's no point just taking all those data and this information from the client and there is no evidence to back them up, and then somebody tells you, I'm earning £40,000 a year. By the time they send you their pay slips, you realize that they are earning £25,000 a year, and then the whole thing collapses in that state, and they say, oh, this mortgage broker couldn't get me a mortgage even after promising that he could get me a mortgage. So before I go as far as obtaining a decision in principle for you, I'll get all the documents up front, and I will make sure that they match and they tally, and that it's exactly what you've told me. So decision in principle doesn't always translate to mortgage offer, because the details of the property may not be available at that time, or may not even have been considered at that time. So there are still checks and things that needs to be brought into the picture before a full mortgage offer will be made. Okay, so decision in principle does not, again, bind the lender to lending you that money. It is subject to further checks, and subject to formal application, and subject to valuation of the property, and the property and you fitting the eligibility criteria of the lender. So once after the mortgage application process, the next thing that will now happen is that the lender will now consider your formal mortgage application, and if they are satisfied that the property meets the security criteria for their loan, and that you as a person meets the criteria, the eligibility criteria for the person they want to lend, and the purpose of the borrowing meets their criteria, they will now make you a formal offer. It's called an offer of advance. They make you a formal offer. That formal offer is to formally now say, we are happy to lend you this much that you have asked for, based on the information you've given to us and the documents that we have seen. We're happy to lend you this much. So the offer of advance is not a legal contract. Yeah, it is not a binding contract, but the contents of that offer will be the same details that, or most of the details that the legal contract or the mortgage contract will contain. Everything will be in that offer of advance, but then it is still not a mortgage, a legal contract. What an offer of advance simply is an invitation to you to enter into an agreement with the lender. Yeah, the lender is now saying, this is an invitation to you to enter into a legal agreement with us. So that offer of advance will now give you 7-day cooling period. It will clearly state in that offer of advance that you have at least 7 days cooling period to make your mind up, to decide whether to accept that offer or not. It is an offer, so you are at liberty to either accept or reject. In the contract business, or in the contract world, there is always offer and acceptance. So until there is an acceptance of an offer, no contract is established. That is the legal contractual way of defining it. So you've been made an offer. If you like it, what you've got to do is then sign that offer, send it back to the lender and say, I accept that offer based on those terms and conditions, and I'm happy to go ahead. Now, there are certain conditions under which the lender can withdraw that offer. But bear also in mind that that offer is now legally binding on the lender. Once they make that offer to you, that offer is legally binding on them. They have to stick to the terms of that offer, right? As long as you accept that offer is legally binding, they cannot withdraw that offer except on these conditions. One, if you knowingly provided a false, inaccurate, or incomplete information. If that happens, the lender can withdraw that offer. Two, if there are material changes to your situation that would impact your ability to service that loan or that mortgage, if they find out that that could affect that offer, and they can withdraw that offer on that basis. Three, if there's a material change to the value or the condition of that property, which makes that property no longer suitable as a security for their loan, they can withdraw that offer based on that. For example, imagine the flood or the flooding that took place, that happened in the UK in recent weeks. Imagine if there was a property that was in that flood area and it was flooded prior to the sale process being concluded. I would imagine that a lender who witnessed that and knows that that property was flooded, and that property was affected by flooding, automatically that rules that property out as being a suitable security for lending. They will withdraw that offer, and they might give one or two conditions if that offer will come back, or they might completely say we're no longer going into that deal again. So that's one of the conditions under which they can withdraw the offer. Okay, so so lenders can actually also make what we call an offer in principle. Now, when they make an offer in principle, it simply means that there are specified checks that need to be carried out before this offer, the final and binding offer, will be made. So once those checks are completed, the lenders are bound to send you a final and binding offer. If you don't receive a final and binding offer, it will be very unwise of you to go ahead to exchange contracts based on offer in principle, because an offer in principle does not guarantee that the funds will be made available to you if you have an offer in principle. This is not decision in principle. This is an offer in principle. So it means that the lender said there are a few things we need to check before we give you a final and binding offer. Always insist and always make sure you receive a final and binding offer before you go ahead to exchange contracts. People have gone to take that risk. Some have escaped with it. Some, it hasn't gone down very well, to say, oh, there's an offer in principle, I'm happy to go ahead and exchange contract, I know these checks will come back positive, no problem, go ahead. And if anything goes wrong during those checks and the funds are not made available, the whole deal falls through. Okay, so once that offer is accepted by you, the applicant, the next step will be for the terms of sale to be agreed. So you now instruct your solicitor to go ahead and start preparing and liaising with the vendor solicitor for terms of sale to be agreed, and the two solicitors start talking to each other. One critical thing also that the offer letter, I mentioned it before, that the offer letter must contain is to make it clear to you that you have 7 days cooling off period. Yeah, you have within that 7 days to say, I'm no longer interested, or I still want to carry on. Okay, so once that is done, and the two solicitors are talking to each other, the next stage in the house sale process is the exchange of contracts and completion. Now, once the vendor accepts your offer, and then there's the mortgage offer is in place, it means the funds are almost available for you to make that sale complete, subject to all parties agreeing to the contract. And once that is in place, everything is going smoothly. What you've got to do is to instruct your solicitor to go ahead and start preparing for exchange of contracts and completion. Now, the conveyancing process is what takes place during this process. So the two solicitors work hand in hand, and that's when they conclude the conveyancing process. So the conveyancing process is simply a process of transferring the title of the property from the seller to the buyer. That is the conveyancing. They are conveying the title from the seller to the buyer, and that's the whole legal process that the two solicitors get involved in. What the conveyancing process tends to seeks to establish is, number one, that the property is what it claimed to be. If you say you are selling a 3-bedroom house, it's got to be a 3-bedroom house, so it has to satisfy that. 2, that the vendor has the right to sell the property. Trust me, there have been property fraudsters who have gone to sell properties that they have no right to sell, and they have just forged people's documents, and but there are online checks that are carried out, and there are ways to find out whether you have a right to sell the property or not. And sometimes you might want to sell a property, but the property might have a charge placed on it. That charge might have been by the courts or by a creditor or by somebody who has interest in the property. It means you have no right to sell the property until you satisfy the conditions of that charge. So that's what the conveyancing process also throws up. 3, the conveyancing process will also seek to establish that nothing will stop you as the buyer from obtaining good title to the property. So most of the work done in this exchange of contract and completion stage, or exchange of contract stage, is done by solicitors. And then you might be thinking, so what exactly would solicitors be doing? Now, the vendor solicitor would draw up a standard contract, yeah, of sale and purchase, and then be liaising with your own solicitor, the buyer's solicitor. So you, the buyer, and the seller, you have to sign your contract in readiness for when the solicitors conclude their searches. Because during this process, the solicitors are carrying out searches, but most of the searches are done by the buyer's solicitor, researching the title, researching all possible relationship of the property and the buyer, making sure that the title is right, making sure that the property is what it is, making sure that it's, it doesn't have risk and history of flooding, all the sewage searches, searching the identity of the seller. All manner of searches are conducted by the solicitor during this process. So once both solicitors are happy with the search results and all the legal work involved, they will indicate to both parties, the buyer and the seller, that they are happy with that, whether they are happy to exchange. And if they are both happy to exchange, they say, okay, we're happy to exchange. And then at that point, the buyer pays a non-refundable deposit. That non-refundable deposit is what it is, non-refundable. Under no circumstance will you be refunded that deposit if you pull out at that stage. So once contracts are exchanged, none of the parties can pull out of that deal anymore without incurring penalties or without paying compensation to the other party. Very, very important for you to know that. And if you pull out of that deal as a buyer, once contracts are exchanged, you are going to lose your you are most likely going to lose your deposit. You are going to pay penalty if the seller insists that you be penalized. You'll be penalized. If you pull out of the deal, you are most likely going to pay compensation if the seller decides to take legal action against you. And it applies to both parties as well, not just the buyer. The seller also suffers the same risk if they pull out of the deal. They'll pay penalty, they'll pay compensation if you decide to take a legal action against them. So once contracts are exchanged, technically the buyer now owns the property. So it's advisable at that stage for you, the buyer, to go and insure that property, because the lenders will insist that the property be insured once they are born. But then as a seller as well, it will also be unwise for you to just go and switch off the house insurance just in case the buyer does not insure it before completion. So just keep the insurance running on the property just in case the buyer does not take responsibility for insuring the property or does not insure it. It's important that property remains insured up until completion. Now, technically, at that stage of exchange of contract, the property belongs to the buyer. So a wise vendor should always maintain their insurance on the property until completion is achieved. So once that contract is exchanged, the next thing you've got to do is completion. The next stage is the completion stage. So between the exchange and the completion stage, what the lender does is that the lender will just be preparing the mortgage documentation. The moment both parties have exchanged contracts, the solicitors will agree on a date for completion. Usually the completion date is 28 days from the date of exchange of contract, just giving room for further checks and for things to be tidied up, some loose ends to be tidied up, and some exchanges take place even before the 28 days. We have seen deals that are exchanged and completed on the same day. It does happen, depending on the circumstances and the agreements and the arrangements between both parties. Okay, so completion can happen sooner. Once that is done, on the completion date, the balance of the funds are now transferred to the vendor's solicitor's account, and these transactions take place between the solicitors. So you have paid the deposit at the exchange of contract stage. On the day of completion, the balance of funds are transferred and the keys are handed over to the buyer. And hooray, you are a homeowner. That marks the end of the house buying process. Easy, does it? Does it sound easy? it sounds easy, but you can see that this is a complicated legal process. So you really need to be on the ball, and you really need to know exactly what to expect at every time. Especially first-time buyers, they've been met with lots of shocks, during this during their first house buying process. But serial property investors are used to these things. They do it every now and then, so they know the process. It doesn't scare them anymore. But if you need a reminder of what it is, this video is very, very useful to you. Play it over and over again when you are going to buy a property, when you're getting involved in purchasing a property, to understand what stage you should be at and what you should be doing at every stage and what's happening at every stage, so that you are not confused and nobody confuses you about the stage. Okay, thank you very much, folks, and that brings us to the end of today's episode of Modesty's Mortgage Masterclass. I hope by now and after this you understand exactly what happens when properties are being bought and sold. The house buying process is broken down to you in the simplest possible form and terms you would ever imagine. So by next week, we'll be looking at buying properties on auction, which is another way to buy properties. I will tell you all you need to know about buying properties on auction, and I will tell you all the risks involved, all the advantages, and everything that you need to understand before you go buy properties on auction. So thank you very much, and have a lovely week, and have a successful week ahead of you, and I'll see you again next week. Take care and goodbye.